It's both. It feels like it happened in a flash, and it feels like it took forever, both. And each time we would have a positive editorial on marriage, folks who'd worked all those years knew what it took to get there, but we're just incredibly grateful still. To see younger folks come on and say, of course they're supportive. It's like, so to me, it's very analogous to what we went through with regard to Title IX and women and issues of gender, where we want young women to know on whose shoulders they stand and what it took to get here. By the same token, we don't want them to have to think about it. We want them just to be able to live their life equally and not have to even have a concern about it. So there's a yin and yang to it. And that campaign, 2012, to see what was happening around the country, another big change in 2012, because we had lost as a community 30-some times around the country. The silver lining to that was a huge amount of research had been done. So we had very nuanced focus groups, polling, all sorts of very fine-tooth research questions had been asked, where we were able to know what words really mattered, what type of commercials needed to be done, in a way that the community just hadn't had before. The other thing that happened, and this was post Proposition 8, was something that several of us had been arguing for a long time, which was all of the national LGBT groups finally said, we have to get together and align and work in coalition, or we won't win. And so in past years, in different states, you might have had groups working at cross purposes, or one group might not come in because another group was already in the lead there. The decks were cleared in 2012. One of the things I did in 2006 with Washington Won't Discriminate is I got a number of groups to sign a letter for the first time saying, we all agree and we support this. That was a challenge at the time.
Now it's the standard operating procedure.
Yeah. And so in 2012, we shared information across states. So Maine, Minnesota, Maryland, Washington State. Campaign managers had regular phone calls. We shared polling information. So it really was a marked change in that way as well. The other thing that was very different, I think, is that we had more straight people involved in 2012 than any of the previous campaigns. So there were times when I was the only LGBT person in the room, and you'd look around and go, this is both great and challenging. But that just showed you, how far we had come as a movement, and the fact that we could find the people who had the greatest expertise, whether they were straight or gay, and they wanted to work on this issue, and that made a huge difference. So the talent pool was vast.
Do you think that we?
Well, and so two things. That's a very insightful question. When in the earlier days, when most of the country was still uncomfortable with the concept of marriage for non-heterosexual couples, we had to focus on rights and responsibilities, because we could say, it's all right if you don't believe in any of that, but you do believe that we should have the protection or the right to go in the emergency room or something. So what you're supporting is basically a contract to allow us to, so they could put it in that kind of box and that kind of thinking and say, yes, I want you to have protections and legal rights. What we learned as we started discussing marriage, though, was that didn't resonate with anybody because they didn't think of their marriages that way. And so it allowed them to keep it in that box and say, well, then you don't really need marriage. You can have this other thing because you can get your legal rights and benefits. So it became a very difficult debate to have when you said, well, what would be legally different from a domestic partnership?
A year later.
Right. So what the research showed us, and this is what I mean by the benefit of having lost in 30-some states, was that the polling to those and focus groups in previous years had not been that nuanced. And the way they asked the question would be, do you support marriage or not support marriage? So once you peeled back the onion and started finding out what people were really thinking, they would say things like that. Well, when I got married, it was because I loved Fred and we wanted to spend our lives together, and my mother helped me plan my wedding, and the thing I've dreamed of is seeing my daughter walk down the aisle, and because she's a lesbian, I'm not going to get to see that. In my church, and also all of the things that, the white picket fence, all of that came with marriage, we had been talking about legal contracts and benefits. And that if we wanted to move people to marriage, that's what I mean about meeting them where they are. We had to say, you know what? This is what we care about too. Our parents dreamed of a chance for us to get married and walk down the aisle, and they're not going to get to have that dream unless we change this. Or in my community, I've been a member of my church too for 20 years, and I've seen my brother get married, and my sister, and my best friend, and I want that dream also. I want to be able to walk down the aisle. I want my father to be able to give me away, all of that. So that's exactly right. So in 2012, you saw our TV commercials, our direct mail, our debates, all of that, very different. And it was all about the emotive, why marriage matters in your life and what it means, and that the legal benefits, while important, is not what makes a marriage. And so that was a significant change. Well, remember, for example, in the early 90s when I was working for Norm Rice, I asked the police chief to march in the Gay Pride Parade, and we had, that was Norm Stamper. He wore his uniform, and we had police car and fire truck in the parade. He got, and we got, a lot of criticism for that, and in fact attempted litigation and other things just for walking in a parade, right? So that's, 10 years in that. So there really was a sea change, I think, driven not so much by us politically, but by the societal. I think the Ellen DeGenereses of the world were a huge impact. So the fact that straight people saw on their TV screens, in their movies, saw their heroes, whether they were sports figures or actors, and said they were able to see people who they already loved and admired and respected, and then learn that they were gay. And it changed their, Rosie, Ellen, and so they said, well, maybe all gay people aren't bad. Well, maybe I should get to know a gay person, right? And so here in our state, it was the fact that they got to know. How many times did I go to the Chamber of Commerce talking about gay issues? So as they knew me as a colleague, as others knew from working in government, the reason I was on the National Victory Fund board for a few years was because their mission was to get openly gay folks into office, public and appointed office, because once you have human contact with people, it's much harder to hate them and much harder to make up things about them. So I would say there was the media movement, this entertainment change that I mentioned. There was people coming out in vast numbers, so in the medical community, in the political community, in the educational community, in the business community, people coming out made a huge difference, because you had people in your lives, in your church, in your hometown, in your family. And when you looked at our polling from 2012, the number of people who knew an openly LGBT person was huge. So those two things, I would say, made the most remarkable difference. And then the fact that our elected officials, when the President of the United States said what he said, when Governor Gregoire changed her position, we'd been, talking with her for years, and she was a practicing Catholic, and her church doctrine was what influencing her thinking. Even that summer, when we were talking about whether to go for this in the legislative session in 2012, she wasn't yet aboard. Had she not changed her mind that December or evolved in her thinking that December, we wouldn't have won.
So it was that close.
It was that close. Yeah.
When she came out for it, she came out strong.
She did. And so it was actually, people forget this, it was her request legislation. She didn't just come out and support, she came out with governor's request legislation, and then she lobbied for it. I don't know if you remember this, at the very first press conference, when media folks asked Ed if we had going to win, he said he wasn't sure we had the votes. And the governor took the microphone from him and said, we will get the votes. And she did as she said. Likewise, Governor O'Malley in Maryland. And even more remarkable, I think people forget this, if you look at Maine and Minnesota, it's even a more remarkable story than Washington State. So Maine was in a worse place than we were, right? They had an anti-gay repeal pass. So they were having to go back and undo that. So it would have been as if we had lost 71.
Plus the population.
Small population, no media market, a lot of rural communities. So they had to overcome that. Minnesota, in the midst of the heartland in the Midwest, Michelle Bachmann, they had a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So they weren't even, as you were talking about organizing young people in support of marriage, they had to convince people to come out to stop a constitutional amendment, not to get marriage,
Not
right?
as sexy.
Right. Never happened in the country. We had never beaten back a constitutional amendment. So in the same amount of time we had to organize, they did. They had a larger coalition, more money, more business support, I mean, in the heartland. That showed you how much things had changed. And then they were able to come back within a year and get marriage passed. So when you look at that time compression, if you did a chart about where we came from, you'd see this very slow, and then, just remarkable success. And think about, remember when Brokeback Mountain came out, what that created, that dialogue. It had some very seminal movies and TV shows, Modern Family, when Mitt Romney said it was one of his favorite shows. So you're absolutely right. You have storylines embedded. So to all the directors and actors and producers, Broadway shows, all of those elements, they're ingrained in people's lives. And so they're learning through osmosis. It's not people like me giving speeches or, doing lawsuits where they have their antenna up in a different way. It's coming into their lives in a different way. And also, I would say the religious community organizing on our behalf, much as they had done in the South around issues of race. They stepped up and led in remarkable ways. Hey, in the Norm era, that was when Greta was going through what she went through. We actually penned a letter to Colin Powell to try to get him to change his mind in that era. And of course he wouldn't. But people like Greta and people like Margie Witt and others in the military, when you asked me before what changed, why the rapid change, I should have also mentioned that. I think the DADT, Don't Ask, Don't Tell debate at the national level had a lot to do with the reason we now have marriage equality, because Americans saw their heroes come out and said, oh my gosh, these are people who risked their lives for us, and they're gay, and they want to get married. And so I can still picture the congressional testimony and people on the steps of the Capitol in their uniforms. And to Americans, those are people to be emulated and admired. So the fact that we were able to have that debate and people were able to then see when that change happened that sky didn't fall, and all of those assertions about the horrors that would fall from that didn't happen.
Dang.
Absolutely. All those Congress people met with veterans and met with active military folks and saw them as military people who happened to be gay or lesbian. I mean, Greta Kammermeyer, Bronze Star, nurse, all of the things that we admire, and she put her career at risk.
An impeccable career.
Absolutely, yeah. So those, again, imprints left on the American public made a lot more change than people like I or others giving speeches could do.